Well, a very warm welcome and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shitij Kapur. I'm the president and principal of King's College London. And I'm really pleased to see you all here this evening at this summer reception for the friends and colleagues who are working in our public policy space, and particularly at the King's Policy Institute. It is a particular privilege for King's that many of you join us in our efforts to influence public policy to make the world a better place, as our motto says. But before I begin, can I acknowledge our wonderful string quartet? I dare say they got drowned in the hubbub of conversation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Strand Quartet. What else would you expect here? These are third-year music students at the King's College London. A special thanks to you. Now, King's, the idea of King's arose in 1820. If I take you back to 1820s, London was a city of about 1 million plus people. It was the world's buzziest, biggest city. Paris was the closest at 700,000. So it was no doubt the biggest place to be. And it had no universities. So at that point in time in London, there arose this idea that we needed universities. And as often is the case in London, there arose two ideas of a university. One arising from the city, which enlisted itself as a stock company. And that was a bunch of people driven largely by commercial interests who thought we need a university to help the burgeoning businesses. And then, as you would imagine, from the other side came another idea that you needed a university with perhaps a higher purpose. And it was that idea, and I'll let you smile at that, but it was the Duke of Wellington who, I think somewhere in 1826, held a reception in Great Queen Street in the Freemasons' Hall, inviting people to subscribe to a new university that was going to be King's College London. And of course, he had to explain how was it going to be different. And the idea was that it was going to be different because it was going to use knowledge for a higher purpose. Now, it has to be acknowledged that his sense of higher purpose was likely King, God, and the empire at that point in time. Well, the idea of what the higher purpose should be has probably changed over time. But the idea that you use knowledge to do something beyond knowledge itself, that idea that knowledge can be put to public good, has been an idea deep in the ethos of King's. Somewhere over 200 years, we said we are in the service of society, and that we use our knowledge in the service of society. And this evening is in some sense a recognition of that expression of using our knowledge in the service of society. In recent times, as you would know, King set up the King's Policy Institute. Many of you here are associated with it or influenced by it in one way or the other. And that has been the venue that King's College London has used to bring together its academia, to bring together its expertise, but to join it with the real world of policy and politics. So it's a special pleasure to assemble here today all the people who help us do that. And we thought one of the good ways we could celebrate that is through a fantastic lineup of speakers who could share their thoughts on some of the key challenges that face us in the next few years ahead. So I'm absolutely delighted that we'll be honored to first hear from Sir John Major, the former UK Prime Minister, and the chair of the King's Campaign Board, on where he thinks the world is going and where he thinks the world of knowledge might impact it. We'll then welcome Baroness Louise Casey, who's currently heading up the independent review of standards at the Metropolitan Police and is a visiting professor here with us at King's. And last, but by no means least, Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia and the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's, will be rounding up tonight's speeches. So with a very warm welcome to you, let me get out of the way of our illustrious speakers and invite Sir John to please speak to us. Thank you.
Well, Shitij, thank you very much indeed, and good evening, everyone. It's a lovely summer evening, and I wish to share with you a fear that I have. President Putin's invasion of Ukraine is changing our world in very many unattractive ways. Until this particular war generally has served him well. But war compels violent change far beyond the region of actual conflict. Already you've seen from Ukraine, it's destabilized public finances in many countries. It's created literally millions of refugees, and it now threatens famine to a large number of poorer countries. The United Nations warns of catastrophic hunger for hundreds of millions of people. Now, all this follows another event very recently, the inglorious scuttle from Afghanistan, where starvation is now looming and hungry people, unbelievably, are selling their body parts in order to raise money to feed their families. To us, that's simply unimaginable. And yet for some Afghans, it's a choice they are daily being forced to make. Now, if the attack on Ukraine was a shock, it was because we were blind to the risk. We forgot the human capacity for folly. Putin's war is a wake-up call, a visible reminder that peace and democracy are not inevitable. If it's not protected, democracy can be overwhelmed, value by value, freedom by freedom, nation by nation. It may be that Putin has miscalculated. He thought the Ukrainians would welcome him. He was wrong. He thought his troops would have an easy victory. He was wrong. He thought the West wouldn't offer military aid. He was wrong. But the effects of the Ukraine war are far wider than the uneasy mass graves of Mariupol. Energy security in many countries is now disrupted. As oil and gas prices rise, many countries will need to offer expensive energy subsidies. Vulnerable businesses in many countries may face closures as growth falls and the risk of recession or stagflation rises. The European Union has announced it can no longer permit any third country to destabilize their energy market. And if carried through, the longest preposition in the English language, if carried through, and that caveat always exists, this is a policy that will have lasting repercussions, not least in reinforcing the drive away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. For decades, globalization created an extraordinary growth in trade and prosperity. It quite literally lifted hundreds of millions of people from absolute poverty. But it had its perverse side. It also widened inequality, stagnated wages, and exported jobs from many parts of the Western world. The resulting discontent has added to public unrest with politics, with politicians, and with governments. The Ukraine war has done something else as well. It's increased the political demand for self-sufficiency, for domestic home provision, for domestic manufacturing, and domestic sourcing. And the risk of that is it will accelerate the retreat from globalization. And we'll see. If nationalism grows, globalization will slow further, and our world may face even more international disputes and conflicts. And there is, I fear, a parallel change. The globalization of values is also in retreat. 30 years ago, globalization blossomed. It was a time of hope. The Soviet Union had imploded. Germany was reunited. Apartheid was ended. Democracy spread across Eastern Europe. The liberal order appeared to be dominant. And we believed then that the values of democracy and freedom of thought and deed had won the battle of ideas, and that our Western way of life would become the general ideal in every part of the world. We were naive. It hasn't happened. The democratic and moral convergence we hoped for has been lost, and our high hopes have gone. We're moving towards a multipolar world, not a united one. Freedom House in the United States tells us that democracy has retreated for each and every one of the last 18 years. The trend is unmistakable. And many of the losers from globalization, miserable with their own state of life, have turned towards nationalism and populism in the search for hope. That is a choice with very bad and potentially damaging consequences. I don't like populism. It leads, in my mind, to the degradation of public debate, even in the most advanced of countries. Populist leaders resent opposition and are prepared to undermine democracy and break the law to ensure that they get their way. In countries where democracy is absent or weak or merely under strain, nationalist and populist sentiment has taken root and shows signs that it may grow. Populism is self-interested and can be utterly unscrupulous. We should regard it with fear. It is a cancer that grows. And amidst turmoil, there is always in our world the elephant in the room, China. What lessons is China going to draw from the invasion of Ukraine? Taiwan, I imagine, for one country, will be watching that very closely. Just a few days before the invasion of Ukraine, China and Russia published a joint declaration about how they believe the world should develop. Read it, I beg you. It's profoundly chilling, and democracy should take note. Russia and China, it tells us, amongst other things, have, and I quote, long-standing traditions of democracy that may surprise the Uyghur Muslims in prison camps, or the dissidents in Russian prisons, and every single person who lives in Ukraine. It may also provide a wry grimace in countries threatened by the power of Beijing and of Moscow. The turbulence of our world, as it begins to reshape as it is, while globalization retreats and Putin continues his invasion of Ukraine, is going to change much of our future, and perhaps in ways we have not yet considered. So I think it is time for we in the West to shed our illusions and face reality. We have much worthwhile to protect in our democracies, and I believe we should prepare to do so, and do so without delay. Thank you very much.